Okay, we're continuing our series on God's philosophers with this top academic, really valuable piece of work. The Catholic Herald, a well-researched, fluently written account of a fascinating period. Hannam clearly understands the science, and some of it is dazzlingly sophisticated, and he has an eye for the seductive story. The best parts are a triumph. Charting an epic journey through 6 centuries of history, God's Philosophers debunks many of the myths about the Middle Ages. As James Hannam reveals, the period gave rise to staggering achievements in science and technology. Spectacles and the mechanical clock were both invented in the 13th century. Europe, for instance, had medieval ideas formed as an essential part of the works of Galileo, Copernicus, and other pioneers of modern science. Highly acclaimed on original publication, God's Philosophers reveals the depth our civilization owes to the supposedly dark ages of medieval Europe. It is also a thrilling history of a time of incredible invention and innovation. The book contains much valuable material summarized with commendable no-nonsense clarity. James Hannam has done a fine job of knocking down an old caricature, Sunday Telegraph. Scotsman Hannam, the liveliest of guides, makes enjoyable reading out of some seriously dusty history and difficult ideas. That's from the Scotsman. So he goes, today we talk about science. We have in mind a clear and specific meaning. We picture a laboratory where researchers are carrying out experiments, but the word science once had a much broader definition than it does now. The word comes from scientia, which means knowledge in Latin. Science encompassed all intellectual disciplines, including politics, theology, and philosophy. Theology was famously the queen of them all. The study of nature as separate subject was called natural philosophy, and it is this term that will be used throughout this book. One of the essential lessons of history is that if we use our own categories to describe the past, we will seriously misjudge it. Instead, it is important to understand where people in the Middle Ages were coming from, and to understand them on their own terms. Part of doing this involves looking at subjects that we would consider unscientific today. Medieval people, magic, astrology, and alchemy were all considered to be sciences. More surprisingly, these arcane disciplines contributed directly to modern science by providing alternative ways of comprehending and manipulating the natural world. The distinction between medieval natural philosophy and modern science is a subject of some debate among scholars today. However, one difference is immediately clear. Modern science is naturalistic with no room for the supernatural. From the beginning of the 19th century, science has excluded God from the laboratory. In contrast, for the medieval natural philosopher, God was invariably central to any consideration about nature. Modern science is a very specific kind of knowledge that blends empirical experimentation with rational analysis. Today we take it for granted and trust it to provide us with accurate information about nature. It is hard to believe that a few centuries ago this scientific way of thinking hardly existed before the edifice of modern science could be built. It required the strong foundations that were laid for it in the Middle Ages. The cornerstone was widespread acceptance of reason as a valid tool for discovering the truth about our world. Clearly this could not happen without the approval of the Church, which at the time was the guardian of almost all intellectual endeavour. This meant that the development of reason and its relationship with faith are both important parts of the story. So prevalent did rational argument become among the philosophers during the Middle Ages that the period deserves to be thought of as the beginning of the age of reason. Some historians of science have had a habit of lauding individuals who seem to echo our own prejudice or appear more modern than their contemporaries. When we hear about someone from the past who anticipated our own beliefs, we tend to label them ahead of their time. In fact, no one is ahead of his or her time. On closer examination, we always find that people are rooted firmly into their own cultural millennium. The best example of this is probably Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1590. A recent biographer, Michael White, even called him the first scientist. But surprisingly, despite being a genius, Leonardo had no impact on the development of Western science at all. His influence was entirely in the arts. His lack of focus and constant experimentation prevented him from having as much success even in the field as he could have had. The reason no one followed Leonardo's scientific ideas is that he didn't tell anyone about them. His reputation today as a man of science is based on his famous notebooks, but these did not become known until centuries after his death. His secrecy was nothing to do with fear of persecution or belief at what the church would try to curtail his work. It was simply a character flaw that made him refuse to share his insights. He even disguised his notes by using mirror writing to make them illegible unless they were seen reflected in a mirror. Consequently, and despite his enormous reputation, we'll hear no more about him in these pages. So we'll finish with one last video, and then you can look up the book yourself or find out about the writer and what he writes about.